All right, this is my good friend Max, and hopefully, we're going to get some agreement and some disagreement while we talk about Yuri Bezmenov and also disillusionment and alienation in our modern society. Uh, so, we're going to start by looking at the Yuri Bezmenev video, his famous interview from 1985, um, where he talks about the demoralization of the West and all of that. So give me a minute and I'll pull that up and share it with you. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen for a minute and we're going to watch a few minutes of this video. Are you seeing this?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in four basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism.
Okay, so that's only 2.5 minutes in, and I feel like we could probably break into that quite a bit. So, yeah, ideological subversion. The first stage is demoralization. Later in this video, he says that in America at this point in 1985, that demoralization is complete.
Uh-oh.
Did you
I
hear
think you
that?
froze.
Oh,
Or maybe I froze.
okay. Hold on. Give me just 1 minute.
Uh,
Am I still here?
you cut out for a second. I kind of missed that.
No,
I
that's
think
fine.
so. I think
I
so.
can
Can you
go
hear me?
through it again. Um,
Okay.
let me
Oh, no,
just.
it's fine. So I kind of think the first 2 minutes really set up the rest of the conversation pretty well, because we're going to be talking about alienation and demoralization and those kinds of strategies. So it kind of like it starts to talk about what we're experiencing today a little bit. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the idea that people live in completely different realities, uh, I think, unfortunately, the most topical thing that I could think of is the recent election, where, something like 70 million Americans weren't willing to really accept the results. Uh, so, yeah, I really do think that, like, the demoralization thing, maybe it happened in 1985, but it's definitely still alive and well. But I don't feel like we've gone past demoralization to the other stages, because he taught that, which are destabilization, crisis, and normalization. I don't think I know that the Soviet Empire never successfully destabilized the United States of America. In fact, it went the other way around. Um, while our society may have been subject to ideological subversion and effectively demoralized, I I know that we weren't destabilized because the Soviet Empire is the one that fell apart.
It's a fair point.
Yeah. So he keeps going, and I guess we'll just watch a little bit more because, yeah, he talks about the institutions being taken over and all that, and once again, it's just like that's it's kind of a hard thing to prove or quantify even.
Yeah,
But
anecdotally, it seems true just because it's kind of what we see-ish.
yeah,
It
exactly.
makes the most sense. Yeah.
Because a lot of people want to believe it.
Mhm.
Result, the result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people have been programmed and, as you say, in place, and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept.
Mhm.
These are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country.
Most of them, yes, simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people, and the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. They will join the links of dissenters, dissidents. Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So basically, America is stuck with demoralization, and unless, even if you start right now, here, this minute, you start educating new generation of Americans, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy and patriotism. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins. Never mind, he will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control.
Okay, so yeah, once again, I guess I just can't really get on board with the destabilization thing because, I mean, our economy has been destabilized multiple times since this was taken in '85. We've had multiple economic meltdowns. However, our defense, the the American defense has basically never ever been destabilized, except maybe like Vietnam was like the closest to the American military becoming destabilized. Um, so I guess that's really what it came down to is like we were never able to be destabilized militarily, and that is what made us come out on top. Because as we know, like the USSR was flexing pretty hard throughout the Cold War, and they didn't necessarily have all of the arms and big stuff that they claim to have.
Hmm. And it's kind of funny rewatching this interview because it sounds almost like it seems almost like a matter of scale, like how much of a nation do you want to look at and try to put this framework over it in order to see what you want to see, kind of thing. But to me, when he was speaking, it almost seemed like he was describing the events of 2020, where you had we had gotten to that point where we had be demoralized, and we had a group of people who refused to see what was objectively true, what was true in just the world and public events and science essentially. And that kind of boiled to a head with a presidency that was kind of like the mascot for scientific ignorance. And then it kind of came to another head where we faced our crisis with people actually walking into the Capitol buildings and essentially becoming domestic terrorists in the process. And so like we faced our crisis and we came out on the other side of it, and now we're hopefully good. But I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of things that need to be repaired, and the COVID-19 crisis as well has kind of influenced the way in which we society in general. But
Well, before there's a transition that has to take place between crisis and normalization, and that has to do with the transfer of power that he said specifically. So people would be like, "Oh, well, that's what happened. Joe Biden won an unfair election, and that was the transfer of power. And now we're under a Marxist regime, and they're going to normalize. Now we're in the process of normalization of this Marxist-Leninist ideology." And it's like, oh, that's crazy because we don't have a planned economy or anything like that that's even close to Marxist.
yeah. And it's funny how people are so quick to be triggered by the term Marxist economy and not realize that a lot of the foundations of our society are based in socialism, like the roads that we drive on, the school that we enjoy, hopefully, and and the fire department, the police department, all these public services that we rely on as a civilization to maintain order are actually socialist structures. So it's kind of funny to see the ability to cognitively dissonate from yourself to kind of reason the way that you want to reason as opposed to the reason the way that you probably should based on the facts.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk to a little bit about the institutional thing that he was saying there. And I'm going to bring up this other article that was basically um, just so everybody else knows, all four people that might watch this. This is a big, giant review of Yuri Bezmenov's written works. So I guess you could say it's like cherry picked or whatever. But so like this will be a section where you have a big long passage from Yuri Bezmenov, and then this person reviewing it will write their review of the previous passage. So what I really wanted to talk about, and we can actually just take these quotes and sort of look at them by ourselves and unpack them and see if we agree with the analysis that this guy sort of gives for these quotes. And this is one starting with the media industry. So people habitually, this is from Yuri, people habitually refer to the American media as free, ignoring the obvious and commonly known fact that most of the most powerful media in the USA is already monopolized both financially and ideologically by what are referred to as liberals. American media chains belong to fewer and fewer owners who do not seem to mind that the media is being almost totally liberalized. Liberalism, in its old classical sense, means above all to respect individual opinion and tolerance to opposing views. However, in my experience, communist defectors who have requested and sometimes literally begged to have stories of their life in the Soviet Union told to the American people via the major American media have been completely ignored. And that's like the things where people are like, oh, conservative voices are being silenced. Literally the exact same trope. Like,
Mhm.
it's what he's saying right there. So I'll read this his analysis because I actually do agree. Monopolization of the media actually was indeed a real problem even in the mid 1980s. But firstly, I found no evidence that the Soviets had any direct involvement in such. And secondly, Bezmenov also wrongly claims that the media was even then being dominated by liberals, which, by the way, has never actually been the case at any point in American history. And I could bring up other studies, but yeah, that's just a fact. Like media has never, it's it was biased up until it was unbiased up until a certain point. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the unbiased period of the media. It just seems like everybody's always trying to spin a story.
Yeah, no, I
Um,
think there was some laws that were in place that required media outlets to be fair in their news reporting, and I believe it was in the '80s when Ronald Reagan repealed those laws and Fox News was created. Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah. I
yeah,
know that there's versions of protected speech, or there's classifications of protected speech that qualify for an individual as opposed to a corporation. In the instance of a corporation, especially in their advertising, they are not allowed to misinform the public. But it doesn't seem very enforced, especially in the instance of news or Fox News. But I mean, I don't think that they're entirely considered a news organization. They're more of an entertainment classification by the FCC, right?
yeah. Well, I'm not sure about their FCC classification, but I do know that like the reason they were able to come out as a news organization in the first place is because of the laws that were repealed that had created somewhat unbiased journalism. Like in the days of like Peter Jennings and like the old like Cronkite and all those guys, like they had to follow certain guidelines that were later gotten rid of.
Well, that sucks.
Yeah. So there was another quote in this article, and it's yeah, also about like leftist stuff, but this is about like the criminal justice system, which is just kind of crazy. So, this is the quote from Yuri. And I'm going to read the quote first, and I want to see what how you respond to it before I read the analysis.
Sure.
Several generations of American lawyers and lawmakers graduating from the liberal, that is, leftist, socialist oriented schools, after long-time exposure to the socialist ideology, have already created an atmosphere in the U.S. judicial system whereby underprivileged criminals are treated as victims of the cruel American society, and the real victim, the law abiding society, is turned into defenseless and very underprivileged citizens and taxpayers paying for a comparatively comfortable life of the criminal in or outside of prison.
It almost sounds like he's kind of hitting the nail on the head essentially with the perspective of like the Conservative Party and trying to cut back like the social reforms that liberals generally tend to vote for, or Democrats tend to vote for, and like the social services that like get food stamps or have affordable housing, and you're just like, or he's just kind of like throwing everybody who's on these services into the umbrella term of criminal, and that's not really fair because it's obviously a little more complex than that, and just because someone can't afford food because there isn't a livable wage doesn't make them a criminal.
Yeah. So that's exactly like this guy says right here. There were a fairly large number of people in our prison system who were a product of severe environmental issues, some of which were structural, including people who had been falsely and otherwise unjustly imprisoned. Unjustly imprisoned.
Yep.
uh, yeah, like his quote just ignores all of that. It's like, oh, so you're just going to ignore the fact that these people have extreme environmental circumstances that have made them victims of the criminal justice system.
And I think it's interesting that that Mr. Bezmenov kind of keeps on like referencing like Marxism and Leninism in and socialism in the sense like he definitely has a motive in trying to undermine those philosophies, and kind of uses them as like trigger words in the conversation. And in from the article that you, or the essay that you sent me with the disillusionment and alienation in 20th century literature, where you say that Marx actually speaks of alienated labor under capitalism in which work is compelled rather than spontaneous and creative. It kind of stifles that possibility of getting out of such a system where you want to have that ability to be creative and work around with your resources, especially in the richest country in the world, where you're supposed to have this golden paved road that kind of lays it pretty clearly and makes opportunity available to you as a citizen. But here we are with that not entirely being the case.
Yeah, and what's funny is like Marx talked about that, and it's like supposed to be part of that ideology. But if you literally just instead of saying Marxist, use the word UBI, you can literally get like libertarians to agree with everything that you just said. Like that's the thing. It's like, oh, you have the freedom to work and do what you want and blah 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 and all this, and it's like that's what Marx was trying to do. They're like,
Yeah.
no, that's UBI. It's different. And it's like, okay, tell me how. I'd love to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I think in the countries where they have actually implemented a UBI, it's kind of been overwhelmingly positive. Like not
Yeah,
only in the sense that like it's helping support the population, but it's also making the population more productive in the sense that they're less worried about making ends meet and more focused on doing the things that they are passionate about, which makes them more effective workers. I think that's
exactly.
very powerful.
Yeah. You get people being more productive because they like the work that they're doing.
Hmm.
So there was, I guess we could not really switch gears, but since you brought it up, I'm going to bring up that other article, which I have clipped together myself. Okay. So, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, alienation in social sciences is the state of feeling estranged or separated from one's milieu, work, or its products or self. Despite its popularity in the analysis of contemporary life, the idea of alienation remains an ambiguous concept with elusive meanings. Powerlessness, estrangement, meaninglessness, despair, and pessimism are the key factors for alienation. So, um, that basically sounds like everybody in the 21st century.
Which may or may not be a result of that demoralization of a nation strategy or not.
Exactly. So they talk about cultural and social estrangement. I wanted to, because there was some, I get people talking to me all the time about the culture wars. And I, man, guess I'll have to control F it. Um, da, da, da. There we go. Yeah, so this was what I was wanting to talk to you about with culture because it's such a it's a term that I think gets thrown around a lot. So I wanted to sort of define it for this conversation. The term culture must be explained, which can be described more pragmatically by dividing it into two types: objective and subjective culture. Objective culture is the totality of the material and spiritual context in which we live. On the other hand, subjective culture is the other side of understanding how culture works. It requires the extent to which objectified culture is internalized by actors. Subjective culture is what individuals internalize objective culture, and which becomes insinuated in their personalities as their identity. So it's basically like, it's almost like objective and subjective reality.
Yeah, there's a lot to
So,
unpack there.
yeah, I should, I wish I had a question for you. But yeah, like, would you agree with that, like, sort of definition of culture, I guess?
I mean, I guess I'm just used to thinking of culture in terms of like a set of rituals or norms that we ascribe to just in the environment in which we're raised. But it is a little more complex in that each culture is an amalgamation of each individual's that culture's experience and how they interact with each other, and the norms that are established on an individual basis kind of percolate outward to the rest of the culture depending on the quality of those interactions over time. So saying that a culture can really be defined as one or two things is kind of difficult, but um,
No,
I think
that like
overall,
it
hmm?
reminds me of the fact that culture is evolving, or what you're saying is reminding me of the fact that culture is evolving, which I think this definition sort of glosses over, doesn't really mention.
Yeah,
And like what I was thinking about is like sports culture and like how
yeah,
a certain individual can come along and change the sports culture. Like, for example, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan came along and changed basketball culture forever. Like he changed American culture, but that's one specific thing is like how the specific sports culture of basketball culture changed because of one individual.
hmm. And as a human structure, it's prone to those kind of sharp and sudden evolutions thanks to those individuals. And it's very interesting to consider. And the reverse can be true. Like the negative aspect of that is also true as well, especially when we consider historical figures like Hitler and Lenin, who had those massive impacts on their culture and just kind of changed the world for the worse. We also have those people who change it for the better, like Carl Sagan and other scientists that I'm very much in love with. But um, it's just it's interesting because like even in my own personal life lately, I've been kind of coming to the realization that to like in general, whenever I meet someone, it's always like, tell me about yourself, and they either define themselves using one or two strategies, and that's either they define themselves by what they are not, or they just define themselves by what they have done or what they feel, and they use very like um, terms that kind of imply a degree of finality, where you have like, I am this thing, and I always have been this thing, and I will always continue to be this thing. But that isn't really true. A human being cannot always be one thing for their entire life. We are an action, not really something that is frozen in time. Even from moment to moment, we can be different. We can surprise ourselves. And so to say that culture, like humans, are one thing is not entirely accurate. And so for me, and even earlier today when I was just trying to wrap my head around like how we define culture and how we explain it to the people that we hope to perpetuate it with, it seems like a very abstract abstract concept because like we can see the results of culture, but as far as like looking at a structure and saying that's culture, there isn't really something like that for us. We may have statues, we may have libraries, we may have books full of history, we may have methodology, we may have strategies that help us try and tackle the future, but is that really culture? I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, so it's funny because when you talk about individuals and then you go to culture, like it's hard to judge a culture by its actions, whereas people are much easier to judge
Mhm.
individually and determine a person's identity through their actions rather than through like labels, um, generalized labels, which I think are more often used to describe cultures, which is incredibly unfortunate because cultures are far more nuanced than the generalized labels that we're ascribing to them.
Yeah.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about with you was disillusionment, which is kind of the same thing, but I'll just I think it has definition here. Yeah. Oxford Dictionary defines disillusionment as disappointment and pessimism that is felt when it is realized that something that was thought to be true was not, or when it is realized that something you thought was good is not as good as you believed it was. It causes a feeling of disenchantment and disparagement. Yeah, I feel like so many, like once again, like so many people, like fit into this category of disillusioned, and that's just sort of like the 21st century malaise that we're in right now.
Are you saying that disillusionment has become part of our culture?
Uh, so like that's the thing. Yeah, I want to say yes because, and I'm also like the demoralization and disillusionment. It is kind of a like 1-2 step thing. I that's the way I'm seeing it. And like we were demoralized for so long, like he said in 85 we were already demoralized. So what happens if 30 years later we're still in the same situation? Like, are we still being demoralized? No, I think at this point we are disillusioned.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think
Yeah.
it's interesting though, because like that strategy can obviously change over time, just as humans and cultures do. So maybe the disillusionment of that time is different than the disillusionment of this time. But I think to a certain degree that all cultures experience a certain percentage of the population that are disillusioned, and that's what produces counterculture. And so we have things that not everybody really ascribes to in a particular culture, and then they seek to find either social or individual validation through other means. And that's the origin of finding and creating those like-minded individuals that kind of help you create that counterculture to combat that disillusionment. Just because like you don't see yourself reflected in an institution doesn't mean you aren't valid in your own existence, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize that like there's light at the end of the tunnel from the way you just put it. Is like, yeah, mainstream culture might not be doing it for you. That's why you have to do you and figure out your own objective culture.
Yeah, and then also like having that kind of mentality isn't that's also like a counterculture kind of disillusionment strategy where you can try and like in trying to empower the individual by helping them realize the degree to which they can control their lives will only sometimes help them realize just how powerless they are in their own lives because it's very easy for you and I to consider our experience typical of the human experience because it's all we've ever known. But for those people who don't have access to the things that we've always had access to and take for granted nowadays, it's difficult for them to even fathom having the freedom to contemplate things like this. So I think that that's also a kind of sobering realization to kind of apply to this entire mental model we're constructing with how disillusionment relates to culture and how culture relates to individuals and how it's all kind of circular and amorphous and doesn't really delineate itself into very even packages.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, like trying to put labels on it is maybe counterintuitive. Um,
But for the scientist in me, it's kind of what we need to do. I mean, astronomy was discovered just by looking up at stars and be like, that's a different color, that's a different color, let's call them something.
yeah, there was these quotes from Marx, or not from Marx, about Marx. Um, Marx spoke of alienated labor under capitalism in which work is compelled rather than spontaneous and creative. That's exactly what you were talking about earlier, and that's exactly what proponents of UBI will talk about. But when you tell them that like that's a Marxist philosophy, their heads explode.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because like just the I think our culture, like one of the aspects of our culture these days is that we're very much built on sloganography, where a particular set of buzzwords strung together in a certain way will appeal to the emotional aspect of a human being and draw out their worst qualities. And then it's very easy to hunker down on those worst qualities and kind of take that hard stance on something that doesn't even really matter to their individual experience because it doesn't affect them. But when
Yeah.
you really ask them about this kind of thing, they really have a hard opinion about it, even though it doesn't really matter. But on the whole, I think I'm just kind of like just running through my memories and just kind of trying to consider the times in my life when I felt disillusioned or alienated from certain things. And at least in my own personal experience, like the first thing that comes to mind when I think of disillusionment in my own personal life is when I was in my chemistry class in high school. I had this very regimented teacher, and not in a way that was compatible with my learning style. It was just like he would just sit there and lecture at us and then write a formula on the wall and expect us to get it. And I didn't get it, but I was trying. And then there was this one point where like I was at my peak frustration and there was this one assignment and I gave it my all. I worked so hard on it and I was like this is something I can do. And so I did it. I'm not going to lie, it was the best assignment in the class because I used actual construction paper. I made it very pretty. Everybody else just scribbled it with like, with on a piece of like binder paper with their pencil. And I was like full on Sharpie and rulers and everything. And I was just so thrilled about it because I was like, there's no way I'm not getting an A. And so like we're walking up to his desk and we're handing it to him and he's just kind of like checking and checking. And then it gets to me and I hand it to him. He looks at it and he's like, I'll try to give it a good grade, but it doesn't look like anybody else's. And I was like, well, yeah, the prompt was like organize these elements in a way that makes sense to you. And I was like, this is how it makes sense to me. And he was like, yeah, but it's wrong. And so, and so like he put a big old red zero on it. And I look at it, I look at him, I take it, I rip it in half, toss it into the recycling, and I just put my head down for the rest of the semester. And I was like, that I'm done. And that's like the most disillusioned experience I've ever had. Fortunately, I guess, but it ruined chemistry for me for at least a decade.
That's so specific. Like I was gonna like the most I could talk about is like feeling disillusioned after graduating from high school, like not knowing what to do. Like that's very, very specific. I got
Yeah,
nothing on that.
yeah, I think it just kind of like a disillusionment is definitely a spectrum, just like any part of the human experience. There's going to be a range of different things that we can kind of qualify as disillusionment. And for me, it's very specific. For you, it's kind of like very atmospheric, where you hit the quote unquote real world after high school, and you just see an endless set of roads that you can travel down with no particular destination at the end of it. And and yeah, it's really funny. But I remember like that exact moment because it was a very emotional experience for me because I was so furious because like I wanted to get it. I've always loved science. It's always been a part of my being. And at that point, chemistry had been the most difficult topic I had ever had placed in front of me, and so I really wanted to master it.
Yeah.
And then it got to this point where it wasn't a possibility, and I was just so upset. I was so disillusioned. I felt alienated from like my even my own personal values of like that
Yeah.
scientific curiosity and just like that burning curiosity that I needed to just like answer. And it's just like having this entire door just slammed in my face when really it's this aspect of reality that physically describes the quantum realm is just it was devastating. So that
Yeah.
stands out in my memory as far as like disillusionment goes.
Yeah. You realize that something you thought was good was not as good as it
Yeah.
thought it was.
Exactly.
Exactly. All right. There's really only one more quote I wanted to read. Like, there's some good stuff about Marx in this article, and I know you read it, and like, I know we would just agree on all of this. So, there was one more thing I wanted to talk about, or just one more quote I wanted to really say in the spirit of this video. Um, some sociologists observe that individuals become alienated when they perceive government, employment, or educational institutions as cold and impersonal, unresponsive to those who need their services.
This actually came up today in my classroom. There's only so much, there's only so many hours in a day, and there's only so many minutes in a class period. And when you have things like, or tools that we can use in the classroom, like Pear Deck or Nearpod, where students can, like, it asks them how they're doing, and they can answer with a smiley face or a frowny face. And then you can see that throughout the lesson when they're responding to the prompts on the Pear Deck.
Yeah.
Um, all like I would say 90% of them had that red frowny face, and it kind of upset me because like we have 30 minutes of instructional time with them, and we can't really like we need to meet the standards. We need to make sure that they're prepared for the AZ merit and the AZ Psi test, and so like we don't really have the time to unpack what they're feeling and help them come to realize like that their emotional truth right now will not always be their emotional truth in the future, and help them kind of create those resilient strategies in themselves to be like, yes, this is how I feel now, and this is a valid feeling because this is just my gut reaction to what's happening around me, and that's natural and that's fine. But what can I do to get out of that kind of thing? And so like this COVID model of learning is really kind of doused the flames of social emotional learning, and it's And then on top of it, we have everybody who's frustrated. Admin is frustrated, parents are frustrated, kids are frustrated, teachers are frustrated. So it's just like there's so much we want to do, and there's so much that we just can't do because of the physical constraints of how we experience time. And and then also like you have to watch out for that teacher burnout, which is super, super common. There's so many people leaving teaching across the United States right now, and it's just because they can't make that adjustment, and you can't really blame them because like this model is it's good for some, and to some component I think the things that we're doing now will always be a part of education, like being able to conduct parent teacher conferences through Zoom is very convenient, and you can ensure that actual parents don't have to like carve out huge time parts of their day in order to like come speak with a teacher for 20-30 minutes and really meet the people where they're at, which is really great. But on the other side, when it's like you have to deal with like Zoom burnout for students where they're just on Zoom all day and they don't have that social interaction with their peers crossing periods and during recess, it's just it's really unhealthy, especially developmentally speaking. But what really gets me is just those moments where like even for the in-person students, when I can see just like the sheer misery on their face about where they're at right now and how they can't see the value in what we're trying to give them. Just it just breaks my heart because like that's something that needs to be talked about. That's something I want to talk about as like a central focus in the classroom, as a community, as that learning community together. I think that would have a lot of power and a lot of benefit for the students, but we just don't have the time. And I think that really creates that uh, alienation kind of factory farm essentially.
Yeah, I mean, basically everything's being put on us right now. Like it's kind of crazy. And the teachers that are stepping up, like you, just every teacher that has stepped up during the pandemic deserves like a $10,000 bonus. Like all of our work has gotten so much harder. And like that's just like no one can deny that. Period. We're in the middle of a complete paradigm shift, and it's being not funded like at all. Like some of the money from the CARES Act went to education. Yes. Should more of it have gone to education? Yes. Um, so like I was having this basic conversation with my brother, who's also a science teacher in Pittsburgh. But like, yeah, he was talking about the same thing about like how do you engage a classroom that's half on your laptop and half in person. These are the things that we're having to deal with, and they're not small things. And so we have to do every little thing that we can to make life normal again for our students. Like you said, like get them to realize that this isn't their emotional permanence. This isn't, none of this is permanent. Like we're like, all of this is transitional. So like my mentor runs the student government at the high school that I work at, which is pretty cool because I get to like watch him do all of that. And right now they're planning the senior prom, which I think is great because last year the world fell apart and the seniors didn't get to have a prom. They barely even, I think they had like a drive-through graduation. Like, yeah. So this year they get to do a prom, they get to do graduation. But right now, like that's what it's all about, is like getting back to normalcy a little bit in any way we can.
Yeah, I wonder what they're going to do for our graduation. I was actually just talking to my parents about that because I checked the ASU website for the commencement information because I just ordered my cap and gown. But
Oh,
um,
that's it. I wasn't planning on doing the ceremony like at all.
yeah, I mean, same. I'm not really one for sort of pomp and circumstance, but ironically, it's because I don't like being the center of attention, which why I want to be a teacher is kind of a conundrum. But
I don't like public
um,
speaking.
yeah. But yeah, it's really it's strange. I hope that COVID is under control. It's unrealistic to expect it to be controlled by graduation, but at least by next year, when we can actually have our kids in person, like the entire class. And yeah, but I have been finding that they do respond really well to online discussion boards, like having the ability to conversate in a scaffolded way with their classmates through this kind of discussion format is really a good way to engage them because one of the things that I'm finding that really fascinates me is like um, the what really fascinates me, what I love is just seeing what my students notice and how they and kind of getting to observe them talk to each other about what they notice is like getting to see like a raw side of them in the sense that their pure curiosity and their interest in a particular topic that we've covered informs their discussion and the way that they interact with each other, and that kind of atmospherically builds that kind of classroom culture in an online capacity. Um, but what I really, really miss is the ability to make like actual stations in a classroom and have students divide into these groups, but we have to keep them in their seats even when they're in person. So for contact tracing purposes, and it's really difficult to kind of like do all the things that you know that they would learn most effectively from, but also keep them safe from each other.
Yeah.
And that's just a
Well,
really
there are just like pragmatic solutions where you can like just group the kids online, and then in the classroom, since kids can't move, you just section off areas of the classroom to make groups. That's what I've done to make group work in this
yeah.
situation.
Yeah, but what I really want to do is like group the ones who have similar interests together to, because like what we've been doing is
Well, yeah.
yeah, and so like what we've been doing in my classroom in the STEM class is that so when the semester started, we were covering avionics, and then from there we went to rocketry, and then to satellites, then rovers, and then we explored the inner solar system, and now this week they were going over the outer solar system, and so like it's all in the theme of like following perseverance and its search for life on the Martian surface, and so like 70% of the kids are super interested in the possibility of life elsewhere in the solar system. And so like I'm building them up to a summative assessment where they're actually going to build their own satellite or rover to find a particular version of life that we've learned about, including extremophiles that we're going to be covering next week. And so like there's a lot of students who have very similar interests under this kind of umbrella topic that I'd really like to group together, but it's just I can't do that. And like grouping them together in person via Zoom is they don't really like that because like I feel they feel pandered to and they don't respond well to being pandered to. Um, but on the flip side, I do challenge them a lot. I give them a lot of really high level stuff because I know that they can rise to that level. And for the most part they have, but I have been getting some students who are like, what level is this? This isn't sixth or seventh grade. And I'm like, you're right, but you are doing phenomenal. But but yeah, there's silver lining along every rain cloud is my point.
And we're finding all of them. Well, I'm going to end our recording for now. We can keep talking, but I'm going to stop the recording.
All right.
All right.